A huge mistake I often see so many beginner artists make is they take a reference photo as is without giving any thought to composition at all, and they go right ahead and start working on their drawing or painting, trying to copy everything exactly as is. And this is a huge mistake because your skills with your drawing or painting medium, your understanding of techniques and your rendering of different subjects with whatever drawing or painting medium it is that you enjoy using, they could be amazing. But if your composition is lacking, that can really make or break the piece. And with composition, I mean the different elements that you're bringing into the picture plane and their arrangement in space, the format of your piece, the balance between positive and negative spaces, choosing a focal point and making sure that you're providing a heavier visual weight in some way to that focal point in order to pull the viewer's attention to that area, creating a sense of balance and harmony in the piece. All of this goes into composition design. Even in those rare cases where you do find a reference photo either taken by yourself or that you have permission to use, that does show a great composition and all the aforementioned things, you still want to know enough about composition to be able to change things and bring yourself into the piece. And I totally get that learning about this fundamental can be overwhelming because of all of these different things that go into it. But a great place to start is understanding about the rule of thirds, which for me is more of a guideline than a hard and fast rule. And I use it loosely nowadays sometimes, but I still built up my eye for composition and learned so many essential things about this topic through practicing intentionally with the rule of thirds. So in today's video, I'm going to be explaining what the rule of thirds is, and I'm going to be walking you through my process that I go through when I come across a suboptimal photo that has something that I like, it inspires me to create a drawing or a painting, but it's not optimal for drawing or painting purposes as is. I'm going to be explaining what I do to take that suboptimal photo and keep the things that I like while changing others and bringing other things in. Doing my best to improve the composition for drawing and painting purposes while also bringing more of myself into the piece. With all that said, let's jump in. So before talking about how I apply the rule of thirds to create better looking compositions, I want to briefly explain what the rule of thirds is and why it is so helpful for artists, photographers, and you can even see some of these principles being used in cinema. The rule of thirds, which I see as more of a guideline, tells us that our picture plane or our drawing or painting space that we're going to be working in should be divided into 9 equal spaces. Depending on the format that you're working in, these equal spaces are going to be either squares or rectangles, and these equal spaces are created by placing 4 lines, 2 vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines. After you've divided your picture plane or your drawing or painting space into these 9 equal spaces with these 4 lines, you're going to place the focal point either along one of these lines provided by the grid or in one of the intersections, which are marked here by these red circles that I have added. Of course, if you're using reference photos, it's very helpful to also overlay this grid over your reference as you are drawing or painting. And it is just a matter of doing some quick measuring with a ruler and drawing a few lines with a pencil very lightly. Of course, for this to work, you need to make sure that the proportions of the reference photo that you're observing and the proportions of your substrate or whatever you're drawing or painting on are the same. You don't have to force the rule of thirds if it doesn't make sense with what you're drawing or painting. For example, if you're painting a piece where it's just one single object, or it's a close-up of a group of objects where there is not one single focal point element, then it doesn't really make sense to force the rule of thirds. And you're always going to find examples of great looking paintings where the rule of thirds was not used. However, in most cases, the artist still managed to create some sort of asymmetrical balance in the piece, And they brought in their understanding of composition to keep the viewer's eyes flowing through the piece. They brought in variety to keep things interesting while making use of harmony and integration so that things can look cohesive. And they also made use of visual hierarchy. So certain areas of the piece, certain elements have a greater visual weight than others, which are more supportive in nature. You'll also be able to find portraits created by professional photographers where the rule of thirds has been used. These types of portraits can be very interesting to look at and can provide greater insights into the person's personality because we're able to see more of the context that the person is in. They can communicate more of a story, a narrative, instead of just having the person right smack in the middle of the piece, which is usually something that we're trying to avoid when we're designing visual compositions. It doesn't matter if your focal point is meant to be a house, a person, an animal, or an object. And this is one of the many reasons why it's helpful to use the rule of thirds. It helps us communicate a mood, message, idea, or story more effectively. It helps us develop asymmetrical balance through placing the focal point off center. And it helps us create more visually engaging compositions that the viewer will want to keep looking at. It'll keep their eyes flowing through the piece. One last thing that I want to mention about the rule of thirds is that many people see this as being a simplified version of the golden ratio or the golden mean. And the golden ratio was discovered by a mathematician, not an artist. I did learn about that in art school and how it connects with composition. I will be linking to a few resources down below, which you can check out if you'd like to learn more about the golden ratio. I've just never really enjoyed numbers and I want to simplify things for myself as much as possible, so I just go with the rule of thirds. But as I said before, I think of this more as a guideline than a hard and fast rule. I definitely practiced a lot more with this grid when I was first starting to learn about composition. And nowadays, I just focus on placing the focal point off center. And I also focus on developing balance and also a flow throughout my pieces. That is very important as well when you're designing visual compositions. Also accounting for positive and negative spaces, which you're going to see me fix in this piece that I'm going to be sharing with you. So I use this grid to place my focal point and the major elements in my composition, and then I build on that. All right, so having said all that, let's jump in. This is the original unedited reference photo that I found that I was going to be loosely inspired by for the watercolor landscape piece that I would be working on. I wanted to create a summer-inspired landscape with a barn, where the barn would be the focal point of the piece. And I really liked certain elements of this photo, definitely the barn, but it is not optimal for drawing or painting purposes for several different reasons. And I am never a slave to my reference photos. It is always very important for me to improve the composition and to make artistic choices to bring more of myself into my drawings and paintings. I really like the overall look of this barn, the colors, the structure, and I also really like the perspective that we're seeing this barn from. And I also like other things in the photo, such as the little gate for this corral section on the right. I think that gate provides a nice visual pathway that can lead the viewer's eyes right to the barn. And I also like the type of tree behind the barn, but those colors are a little bit too fallsy for me, and I want this piece to be summer inspired. So I'm going to change the color of those trees, and I'm going to push the trees back by making them smaller in scale. This will help me also create more room for the sky, where I want to create more clouds and just a brighter looking sky. But since the beginning, I knew that I would have to change the location of the barn. I would have to move it more toward the right, because the barn is way too close to the edge of the photo, and that is creating a lot of visual stress for me. I needed to leave a little bit of empty, inactive, or negative space in between the left edge of the barn and the left edge of the picture plane, and make that look a little bit more intentional. I also needed to decide on the location of the horizon line, which is so important when we're drawing or painting landscapes or scenes. So what I did to sort all of this out was I took out my sketchbook and I created a few quick thumbnail sketches to decide on the major elements that I would be bringing into this composition, as well as their locations in space and their size. So this is what I was visualizing for my final piece. The barn would be a bit larger and centered right along the left line in the rule of thirds grid. I would leave a little bit of empty space in between the left edge of the barn and the left edge of the picture plane. I would be bringing down the horizon line closer to the bottom line in the rule of thirds grid in order to provide more space for the sky. The tree line in the distance would also be made smaller to provide more space for the sky. And in terms of elements that I would be adding in, I wanted to create a little path going toward the barn, which would also help as a little visual pathway to help lead the viewer's eyes straight to the focal point. And I definitely knew since the beginning that I wanted to add in some flowers. So I added in some white and yellow flowers down here in this space that looked quite empty in that reference photo. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, rarely is a reference photo going to be good to go as is. Even in those cases when we take that photo ourselves, there's usually something that we can do to improve the composition, maybe crop it a little bit or take something out before getting started with our drawing or painting. And doing your quick thumbnails in a sketchbook is incredibly helpful. It can also be very helpful to practice drawing anything that maybe you need a little bit more practice with before starting with the final piece. And only after having done all of these things do I start giving thought to the techniques that I'm going to be using when it comes to watercolor painting. Always remember that composition can make or break your piece. You could be drawing or painting something that is incredibly interesting and beautiful, and if you can't create that visual balance, managing visual weights in the different elements or areas throughout your piece, if you're having issues with positive and negative spaces, meaning if your subject is too cramped, or if it's looking like it's floating in a vast sea of emptiness, or maybe you haven't decided on a focal point and you haven't managed visual weights very well, and everything in the piece is calling the viewer's attention equally, you could end up with a drawing or painting where everything has the same visual weight, the same level of importance, and everything is competing for the viewer's attention at once, which can be very overwhelming to look at for the viewer and very confusing. So give thought to your focal point, give thought to visual hierarchy, give thought to how you're going to be managing visual weights, how you're going to be creating balance in your composition, how positive and negative spaces are playing with each other, and all of that is going to help you arrive at much, much better results. It'll help you increase the quality of your work. Only after having decided on all of these important compositional aspects do I start giving thought to what specific techniques I'm going to be bringing in when it comes to, in this case, watercolor. When it comes to working with watercolor, it is essential to go in at least with a basic strategy that you're going to be working through, because mistakes are nearly impossible or impossible to correct. And we do have to work swiftly and with a certain level of confidence. And going in prepared and with a plan is going to help you do just this. I have many watercolor painting tutorials where I walk you through my entire process, and in many of them I also include the drawing process prior to jumping into the watercolor, which I would highly recommend checking out. I will make sure to link to some of them down below in the recommended resources section. But a few key things that I always make sure to ask myself as I am creating that strategy that I'm going to be working through are, for example, how many layers am I going to be working in? What am I going to be painting first and what's next?
Where do I want to create soft, blurry transitions and effects? And where do I want sharper defined detail? This is going to help me know when to use wet on wet versus when to use wet on dry, which I have a full video on in case you'd like to check it out. I'll make sure to link to it down below as well. Would it be helpful to bring in masking fluid so that I can block out highlight sections or create certain visual effects? Would it be helpful to bring in an extra painting medium such as gouache? Where am I going to bring in the brightness and the beauty of the paper as part of the piece? Am I going to be changing or manipulating colors that I see present in that reference or bringing in a specific color scheme? Before starting with any new piece, I always plan out the specific colors that I'm going to be bringing into the painting process as well, which I share how to do in many of my painting tutorials.
All right, you guys, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.